All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move forward. We're going to move forward. We had a great opening, with the students who, I thought they were wonderful, and they sort of stimulated us. But now I'm going to turn the podium over to Joanne, who's going to introduce our moderator for our next very provocative panel. So here you go, Joanne.
Thanks, Thornton. So we have an impeccable group of panel participants. This panel's on mobility and security, and I'm sure we won't have anything to talk about along those lines, but Dave Escalante is going to moderate the panel, and they've done a great job of lining up some questions, and I'm sure everybody else has their own share of opinions, so we would encourage you to engage directly with them. And with that, I'll let Dave introduce himself and the rest of his crew.
Thanks, John. How long do we have?
You have an hour.
Okay, just so I can keep an eye on things and don't get the warning from Thornton. Oh, easily. So I'm David Escalante from Boston College, and I'll introduce the rest of the panel and let them say a little bit about themselves. What we tried to do is get a mixed panel representing a bunch of different areas. So we have Dennis Devlin from Brandeis, who's representing sort of the academic side of things, Billbrenner from IDG CXO magazines, who's a specialist in writing about this area. And we have Dick Daniels from Kaiser Permanente on the commercials side of things, and Quentin Jones representing McAfee, who's got knowledge about this area, but he's on the vendor side. So we've got the vendor side, commercial, EDU, and the press covered. So with that said, why don't we give everybody a minute to talk a little bit more about their background, and then we can dive into the topic.
I'm Dennis Devlin. I'm currently Chief Information Security Officer at Brandeis University. Been there for about 3 years. Prior to that, for the 10 years before that, I was Chief Security Officer for the Thomson Corporation before they became Thomson Reuters. For 11 years before that, I was Director of Computing for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. And before that, I spent 13 years in the pharmaceutical industry. Over that time, as you might imagine, have seen a lot of change in information security, most notably, I think in 1988 at Harvard, lived through the Morris worm at a time when the internet had less than 100,000 nodes on it. It was called the ARPANET, and there was no security at all. So it's really been quite an interesting ride, and I look forward to our panel this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Whoops. I appear to be attracting some kind of paranormal. Good morning, everyone. My name is Billbrenner, and I am senior editor with CSO Magazine, part of IDG Enterprise. And I've been writing for CSO for about 2.5 years, and before that, I was at Tech Target for about 5 years, writing about security for SearchSecurity.com. So I've done a lot of writing, especially in the last 1.5 years, about the mobile devices and security challenges in them. And so I'm looking forward to getting into some of what we've reported on.
Good morning. I'm Dick Daniels. I'm with Kaiser Permanente. And Kaiser Permanente, we have about 8.5 million members that we provide healthcare to. We've got about 35 hospitals. And we are in the midst of looking at a lot of different mobile technologies and deploying those in our environment for our physicians, our nurses. We also want to provide some applications for our members so they can access their medical records. We've already deployed electronic medical records throughout our organization. So we use them widely, but we are heavily regulated. We're a nonprofit organization, but we're heavily regulated. And prior to working at Kaiser Permanente, I worked in financial services at Capital One and also at JP Morgan Chase.
Good morning. I'm Quentin Jones from McAfee. I have 2 specialties at McAfee. One is cloud, SaaS, virtualization, and one is mobile. I've been in security for 11 years and McAfee for 1.5 years. My role at McAfee is solution architecture. So sit one leg in the product camp and kind of think about how our solutions should work, and then 1 foot in the industry camp, evangelizing, training internally and externally. My MBA master thesis from UCLA Anderson 2 years ago was on mobile device use in emerging markets. So pretty excited about some of the things happening in mobile and security and where they converge.
All right, thanks everybody. Let's start off just generally sort of bracketing the topic and then dive more into the security things and the specifics. So when people say mobile could be an awful lot of things. It could be the laptops, which is sort of passe. It could be your smartphone. It could be the funny little device that the FedEx or UPS driver is carrying around. It could be OnStar, like we were talking about last night, which isn't necessarily a computer that has a keyboard and a screen per se. So when we're talking about mobile for the next hour, are we really talking about, Quentin? Yeah.
So the conversation in today's security and emerging technology kind of dialogue seems to be mostly about the Android, iPhone OS, Winmo type of devices. It could certainly mobile as our laptops and netbooks shrink in size and become more highly portable and highly internet connected. Certainly this is a threat surface that presents new challenges the way we're connecting them with the pervasiveness. I think mostly people, though, are talking about traditionally cell phone devices that are getting internet connectedness and starting to run a new range of applications, changing the threat surface in terms of what data they're holding on them and how they're connecting to resources and accessing the portals that use this data on them.
So generally I agree, except that when we started working on our mobile strategy, I tried to do that in my company and it didn't work because the physicians wanted to include the wireless blood pressure monitors and the wireless scales and all of those mobile devices. So I tried to contain it for my own benefit, but it just didn't really work real well because they're looking at applications where someone could be at home and they can check their weight or blood pressure, whatever, and wirelessly transmit that information and get it stored in the electronic medical records. So it's really interesting to try to put a barrier around this and be clear about what we're discussing. But it certainly does include the devices like the iPad or the new one that Blackberry just announced, and the Slate. So those devices are certainly part of the definition.
So going back about 3 years, whenever we would refer to mobile device in our articles, it really ran the gamut from laptops to, really anything that was mobile. So in the last year, we've really tightened that definition to really be about the mobile phones and now things like the iPad, just because those devices have become ubiquitous in the last year and a half in a way that we hadn't seen before that. And it used to be I would run into certain executives who would have a Blackberry, and then now it's my grandmother has an iPhone, and she can't even see to use it. So go figure. But the things that people are doing on the mobile phones are the same types of things they're starting to do the same types of things you would be doing on the laptops and the desktops, and particularly when it comes to how information is shared. And we have seen the attack surface really widen as a result.
I guess I take kind of a broad brush perspective on what constitutes a mobile device. It's something you can carry with you easily that grabs an IP address every time it can find one, and that can impact security and privacy. And that's, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information resources that you're trying to protect, and or the privacy of the individual using the device and all of the and sundry things that go along with that, their identity and so forth. The variety of devices is such that it's almost impossible every time you come up with a taxonomy for categorizing them, something else comes out. So I try to look at it more broadly, and that in aggregate constitutes the attack surface that we're trying to defend.
Okay, great. So in general, there's a huge market for the phone type things that we can't ignore. I looked up a couple numbers in there. I got like 4.6 billion mobile phones in use at the moment from a couple different sources, and that's not necessarily smartphones, but smartphones, something like 50 million were shipped in the fourth quarter a year ago just in the US. So this is a huge market. There are a lot of these things that are grabbing IP addresses and connecting. And I think actually the reason the numbers are so big is like of the 53 million, 50 million were lost in taxis, and they had to buy replacements, and 3 million were actually in use. But there are clear security issues associated with these devices if people are storing information on them, and that's kind of what we're going to dive into now. So if you're doing this mobile stuff, what makes it easy or hard if you have a mobile device to put any security into it? And indeed, is there a particular need to put security into it? If you want to go the other direction and start with Dennis?
Yeah, this was interesting. 2 weeks ago, David and I were in New York City speaking at CSO's event called the Security Standard. And I had an interesting experience. I was talking about trying to protect a university and trying to protect lots of disparate devices that you have very little control over, and trying to compare and contrast that to Fortune 500. So I was riding down on the Acela, sitting in the back of the quiet car, which is right in front of the first class car, turned on my wireless scanner on my iPhone and picked up 87 active IP sessions. Okay, so then I started drilling down a little bit more, as a security person would. It's a little gray some days. It's like
next time you're on the Acela, look for this guy.
It's like my hair. It's gray. So open SQL sessions, open SMB shares, lots and lots of things that if I were a black hat would be very, very appealing. Similarly, walking up and down the aisle. Wasn't too hard to shoulder surf. Wasn't too hard to overhear conversations. So my colleagues in Fortune 500 that think they have this bastion and this Maginot line around their organizations, the most senior people are where you get the most diversity of device, because they want the latest, greatest thing that they saw in an airplane magazine. And it's no different in higher ed with students and faculty and so forth. So the perimeter, if you will, the only place you can defend this ultimately is not even the device, it's the person. When we think about security as people, process, and technology, I am convinced more than I ever have been before that we really need to focus on the people and the process. And we need to educate people to think the way that we think, and we need to focus on business processes to make it easier for people to use sensitive information in a safe way, i.e., in almost like a dumb terminal mode, where I'm viewing something maybe on a portable device, but it doesn't get stored on the portable device. Because to David's point, if you look at any of the Ponemon stats about, they put up the big pie chart of where information is lost. It's lost laptops, it's lost USB devices, it's lost. And, we really need to make it easy for our constituents to do the right thing. And that's very, very hard work on our part.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely dead on there. And you guys did a great job at the security standard, by the way. Okay. I was there. But, one of the things that I've noticed is with mobile technology, it's very difficult for an IT organization to flat out say, this isn't allowed. We're going to stop you from doing this. I see the same thing when we cover the security implications of social engineering, Twitter, Facebook, all of which people are doing. I see people doing those things more on their phones now than I see them doing on their computers in the office. But what I've noticed is IT operations are trying less and less to keep these things out of the network, and it becomes a matter of how do we allow these things in a secure way. And to your point about awareness and educating people, That's really the strategy that I've seen a lot of organizations, particularly in academia, and not so much in the financial services realm, but in institutions where open access is a much bigger deal. There's a lot more emphasis on educating the user. And I have seen in some cases, Kraft Foods, for example, they're letting people use their iPads, the iPhones for business and for business email and trading information. And for them, it wasn't a matter of blocking it out. It was a matter of how do we use these things which can be useful to us in a way that's secure. And it can never be done 100%, but it can be done.
Now, I'd like to just take a step back and tell you about something that we're right in the middle of. We're in the process of rolling it out, but it just speaks to the fact that we do need to make it more usable. And this was just securing USB ports where you can plug in removable media. And we wanted to roll out a product so we can secure that. But we ran into all kinds of problems with physicians because, frankly, there were people who were using USB-type devices for either storing data, putting patient information on those USB sticks, and in some cases providing those to patients. And the fact that we wanted to secure those and implement encryption so that you require a password to access it created lots of problems. We found out that because there are a lot of things that happen we don't know about. We found out that in some cases, dermatologists were using their cameras to take pictures. And then they were, taking the card from the camera, putting it in their computer to copy that information over to put it in someone's electronic medical record. So, now what do if we're going to force a password when they put it in? So, just those kinds of things in the different applications that people have, we have to find a way to do it so that it's easy for them and it's usable so it doesn't get in the way of what we would call workflow. So that's just a real live example. And then when we get to phones and we get to iPhones, we get to iPads and those type of devices, being able to have the right security on those devices as well as keep it usable is a real challenge.
So to the point about consumerization as a broad term is what I'll call it, right? About IT devices and the stopping of your users because you make a management decree that it's not a secure way to do things. We've seen in a completely different context a very similar attempt failed at trying to stop the Twitter and the social media apps from various military organizations in the Middle East and North Africa areas of the world in the last 2 years. And the people are tweeting, even if on a government level you say the internet is blocked to these things, and they find a way. So people are bringing their the empowerment of the individual as kind of their own personal IT capabilities expert. The democratization of IT, making these screens get very large, one of the major trends. The CPUs become very powerful, another major trend. The apps become very accessible to interface with all kinds of data as another major trend. Makes it near impossible to keep these devices out of the enterprise, no matter what decree you make. So what can we do to secure these? Here's the things I see people talking about most commonly. The enablement or disablement of cameras, for the aforementioned reason, is a big one. The encryption of data at rest, chiefly on the device. The communications security. So are they, which is a couple things, authenticating correctly? And then are they talking securely? So is it an encrypted session, SSL, when it's potentially transmitting patient healthcare information or social security card numbers or other sensitive data? Are PINs or passwords to get on the device in the first place enforced as another major concept? Is there remote wipe capability? That's another major thing, which you can get into a lot of, that goes quickly into the weeds, but selective wipe or complete wipe, at least some remote wipe. We're even seeing some consumer services and devices come out to offer this outside of a corporate IT sense, right? There are several providers on the market today who will sell you, an individual, a remote wipe capability for your device. I think Apple does it inherently through the Mobile Me, but there's also things for non-Apple phones where you can.
Microsoft has it too. It's called a crash.
Yeah. So you can go to a website and see. Well, and this, is an interesting thing. And so you can go to a website and see where the GPS on your phone is reporting the phone to be in the world. So then you start thinking about location-based stuff. Now all of a sudden I'm reporting where my phone is. Who am I reporting it to? Certainly Fort Meade knows where my phone is. Does my insurance company know where my phone is? And my phone's kind of always with me, right? This is a very close proxy to where I am from a zip code standpoint or even to the meter. And then all things that you can scheme up in a very negative sense about where that data could go and the implications of such a thing.
Okay, great. I think I'll loop back to sort of what a couple of you were saying and ask, how can we reconcile, I guess, what I would call traditional security, which is passwords and encryption and some of the rest of the things that Quentin was saying, with people's need to use a mobile portable device that they're on the move with in a active, reasonable fashion. So I say to myself, all right, so there's a corporate rule that says I have to have some 10-character strong password on, the funny little keyboard on my phone here, and I'm driving down the highway, and my phone is locked up, and I'm supposed to type in some strange 10-character password on the tiny little keyboard. Is that safe? Is that smart? Is that good security? Is there anything we can do from an innovation perspective or as an industry or from a security perspective to make security sort of still work but have a different paradigm on these mobile devices? Is that necessary? Is that someplace we ought to be going?
These are complex problems, right? There's a probably 20-year, 30-year trade-off since the Morris worm debate between security and usability, right? The most secure network or system is one that you unplug from the internet and bury under the ground 20 feet deep, right? Anything other than that, and you're exposing yourself to some risk surface. And so is that risk exposure you create of equivalent value to the accessibility or the productivity gain from having that exposure, right? So any innovation to the area of authentication or a more clever or efficient way to do encryption or a more than certificate-based clever way to do device authentication. What's funny, actually, a lot of the mobile device security conversation we have as a company today, usability is still a big driver in this. And most people don't come to us saying, how do I secure these things? They say, how do I provision these things in the masses, the droves that they're coming to me? So I want to put a security layer on my iPhones. How do I get these users enrolled in my service correctly? That's actually a lot of the security, what's selling the various makers of security software for these devices. That's a lot of it. Self-service provisioning, password resets, dealing with the users in masses. So security's got a little bit to catch up here for sure. There's room for innovation. I don't know if I've directly addressed the question, but.
Yeah, the other aspect is regulatory. I mean, there are some regulatory and compliance laws that we have to comply with. So in some cases, it's not going to be as user-friendly as some people would like for it to be, because we have an obligation to comply with the law. So things like not storing data on the devices. For some of them, we just will not store anything on the devices. It's also interesting that BlackBerry set a really good standard in terms of security. And now we see more consumer devices like the iPhone and others that don't have as much concern about security as what we would like. And now there are some third-party packages coming along that will provide the level of security that we're looking for. So we're trying to find that medium where we can have the level of security that we need and have it ubiquitously for the different types of devices, or we're going to select what we're going to use internally and tell people that's the only thing that you can use. Now, to your point, people figure all kind of things out because we say this is all we're going to support, but I just learned of a situation last week where there was one individual who did not like the standard. So we use Lotus Notes for email. So this creative person wrote a rule in Lotus Notes that automatically forward all of his email to his outside account so he could get it on a device that he wanted it on. So, we get people that are just very creative and figure things out.
That's actually very impressive. I want to meet this guy.
Yeah, I want to meet him too.
I bet you do. So, one of the more interesting areas of coverage that I've pursued with all of this was when Barack Obama was first elected president. And some of you might remember that there was a big fuss about whether he should be able to have a BlackBerry when in office. And I, just as a discussion point, wrote a column that said something to the effect of, well, so what if he has a BlackBerry? Can't, they're smart there. Can't they just secure it? And I got some very creative feedback, let's say. And from what I can see, he still has a BlackBerry, so they must have figured something out. And I talk to Howard Schmidt regularly, and he's not telling me what they do. He'll give me a tour of the White House, but he won't tell me how that works. But one of the people I talked to as part of covering that was Joe Hagan. He was one of George W. Bush's deputy chiefs of staff, and he had worked for Bush Sr. as well. And one of his jobs there were two deputy chiefs of staff, and one of his jobs was he handed out the BlackBerries, and it was his job to worry about the security of them. And he mentioned September 11th, how the BlackBerries actually came in handy that day. And so that was kind of when they decided there is a use. So I didn't entirely understand what the big deal was when the talk came to, can Obama have his gadget? But one story I would really love to do is really get a look at what they do to secure that particular BlackBerry. And, maybe it's time to share some of that with the rest of the world. So, right.
I was thinking before when you asked the question about using portable devices with business systems or whatever. Remember the cartoon from the New Yorker about on the internet nobody knows you're a dog, and the dog was sitting at the workstation. And I'm not confident that online systems always know that the endpoint is a PDA. I mean, endpoints can emulate all sorts of things and look like any kind of web browser that you want. So I still come back to the notion of make the systems easier to use in a secure way. All the points about authentication, encrypted, session transport, all of those kind of things apply. And I tend to treat a PDA or a really portable device very different, or not very differently than any other workstation. You don't want to have personally identifiable information stored locally on it. You want it to have cleanup, after a session where something is used where there's not cached information on it. You want it properly authenticated. You want the person who's using it to be properly educated. In the case of workstations, I still wish someday I could meet the person that came up with the original name personal computer. Because it's a mixed message that we give our employees, in our case, our students and so forth. If you think of it as a personal device rather than an enterprise workstation, you tend to mix personal things with business things. And that can present some problems. If you look at the laws nowadays, it used to be that if a machine got infected, what would you do? Worst case, if you can't disinfect it, you just wipe the hard drive and send them on their way and reinstall the operating system. Now, with the laws you have to do forensics and kind of take a look at it and say, was there personally identifiable information on there? Could this have been disclosed? And you know what you find out much of the time? If there is PII, it's the individual's PII. They did their tax return on a company-owned workstation, or they had their own personal information on an institutionally owned workstation. And that kind of, combining personal things with enterprise work-related things is really starting to cause problems. And on the workstation front, we say computers are cheap enough. You should have a computer at home, use that for your stuff, and use your business computer just for computing. Really high-end, high-risk executives, nowadays, many of them, you'll see them carrying around 2 of these. One of them is an institutional device, one of them is their own device. It's kind of the middle range of people, of which there's the most, that tend to have mixed use on these devices. And the best we've been able to come up with so far is, again, going back to the education process, making people aware of what can go wrong using these inappropriately. And then, if they do attach to a university system, making sure we put it through all of the same rigor that we would put through any other login session. That is to say, strong authentication, make sure it's an encrypted session, etc.
Question?
I would argue that our lives here, at least in the United States, but I think overseas as well, have become much too fluid to define work and personal. I've moved to a completely mobile platform because I work at home in the evenings, and when I come in the morning, I read my newspaper, which is personal. Having 2 machines, that would be completely unrealistic. So yes, there's personal data on my machine.
Is it confidential personal data or incidental personal data? I mean, there's 2 different things. I mean, if someone's looking at CNN on their work machine, that's very different from doing your tax return or keeping your own financial records on there, doing all sorts of online shopping where credit cards are getting cashed and so forth. Because in the event that machine is compromised, it's neither fish nor fowl. It's not your personal device and it's not an institutional device. And that becomes a problem.
Well, when you're starting to use cloud browsers, your personal and your private machines also get mixed up, or Dropbox. So it doesn't really matter which machine you're using. It's all tied together as far as that goes.
Well, we haven't begun to deal with the cloud systems being compromised as much as we've been dealing with the individual workstations that are compromised right now. So, I mean, that's a problem we just haven't encountered yet.
As security experts, microphone.
You guys share.
As security experts, what do you guys do to protect yourselves on mobile devices, PCs, whatever it is that you use?
Want me to go first?
Sure, go ahead. You have the mic.
This was off. I was wondering why it wasn't picking up paranormal activity. It's because it was off this time. All right, I may be putting myself up for ridicule, but as somebody who writes about this all the time, everyone in my family thinks that I'm an IT expert at this as well, and that's not necessarily the case. I talk to people who know better and translate it into a language everyone can understand. But for my own personal situation, I have the work laptop where I do mix personal activities with business activities. But there are things I won't do. There are things I wouldn't do anyway. Like, I'm not going to use a work machine or a personal machine, for that matter, to go surfing porn sites, right? I'm not going.
Not a financial regulator, right?
Right. No tie here. I'm not going to be going on gaming sites. Those things I won't do because one thing I've learned from covering it and from experiences of relatives and friends is that when you do that sort of thing online, you end up with more infections. And for folks in this room, it's obvious. But, I write a personal blog. I do it on my work machine. When I'm on Facebook or Twitter. Now, it's a little more complicated for me because being in the media, I use a lot of those things as part of my job. And so it becomes much harder to separate. Social media is just the perfect example of this. And it's so relevant to the conversation because, as I said before, everyone is doing this on their phones. But it becomes so much harder to separate personal from business when you're using something like Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. And, but yeah, I mean, for me, I just try to practice that common sense that if you go visiting places on the internet that resemble a dark alley, you're asking for trouble.
It doesn't protect me on the install.
That's true. I can't help you there.
I don't know that I have the perfect solution for managing my own security. McAfee doesn't have like BlackBerry software, right? Or give us a year. I don't know. So the probably thing I do that's the most broadly applicable, and what do I advise like my family members to do, is same stuff that we've probably been advising them to do on laptops for a while. It's pay attention. To Bill's point, use good judgment in where you go and how you behave. If something seems weird and it starts asking for your password and your internal radar's going off saying maybe that's not right, guess what? It's probably not right. Because the human intrusion detection system is probably your best defense against such a thing. I don't know that I'd prescribe any particular encryption protocol or connection method. This stuff even changes every 3 and 6 months. There's something new anyway. Good common sense.
So all of you are sort of you're hinting to where I want to go with my question, and fundamentally the security policy domain is smashing up against the data policy domain, and most organizations that I've worked with, they don't have those very well aligned, normalized, rationalized. So I don't know exactly how to enforce data policy and security policy at the same time and get the outcomes I seek. But it all ends up being policy enforcement, but policy enforcement is around a behavioral model. So how do you create a culture of security where you can get the normative behavior of the end users being, we will comply and incentivize that behavior? Because it's a behavioral problem that we tend to just throw technology at, and it's not very successful.
You're absolutely right. Go back to people, process, technology. And there's not, unfortunately, a technology solution for this. If there were, we would have all purchased it by now. The procedural stuff, the process stuff, some of the point that was made before about regulations, some of the regulations are now being very prescriptive, like 201 CMR 17, about how you handle confidential information. And basically, the rule is don't put it on a portable device unless it's encrypted. Places that are more conservative even than that, like my institution and Harvard, say pretty much don't put it on a personal, a portable device at all. I mean, let's work toward, keeping those things on central systems. So that reduces part of the risk. It doesn't reduce the identity theft part of the risk. It doesn't reduce the other parts. And the way that we found that works to that end is to personalize it. Something I learned from my friend Thornton a long time ago is the notion of WIFM. What's in it for me? right? And if you're preaching security to the benefit of the enterprise, most people don't really take that to heart. If you preach it to the benefit of them, suddenly you have their attention and you have their hearts and minds. So we have a campaign this year, our campaign for students. So we used to call it digital self-defense. And that was pretty good. I thought that was kind of neat, a little ninja on it and stuff. But that didn't really resonate as well with the students. So this year I stole from somebody else. If you steal from one, it's plagiarism. If you steal from many, it's research. I usually search the internet, looking for good slogans, and I forget where I found this. Honestly, I'll go back and find it. But the slogan is "Privacy is your business." Okay, so this year we focused on privacy, empowering you as an individual with how your confidential information is used, how it's collected, what it's used for, the accuracy of it, and how well it's that might be okay. It was right here, and how well the information is protected, because privacy is empowering the owner of the information, not the custodian of it. And then in the process, oh, by the way, keep your software up to date, because that will help keep it secure and protect your privacy. Oh, by the way, use malicious code protection, because that will protect your information. By the way, use strong authentication. Oh, by the way, don't let everybody in the world have access to your computer. Oh, by the way, oh, by the way, oh, by the way. So you drive through the same points. But the emphasis is this is you doing something for you, and in the process, you're going to learn something about protecting the institution as well. David, I know, has deployed, and I know we don't plug products, so I won't even mention the product, but it's a product that you can search for PII on your machine, and he's deployed it, and we're looking at it on campus. But this particular vendor offers the product for free for personal use. So we recommend that all our people download it and run it on your computer at home. And if that doesn't scare you, I don't know what will. Because if you do those same things at work, all of those same things are being cached on your work machine. This is your identity. If this machine gets broken into, this is your stuff that's going to get lost. And when people start being conscious and mindful about protecting their own information, they become conscious and mindful about protecting information in their custody as well. And so far, that's the only motivation that we've been able to find that seems to be pretty effective for that.
There's one other thing I want to add. Oh, sure. And that is, we do all the things around training and all of that. But one of the other things that we do is we try to go public with some things that if we have a breach. Some breaches we have to report anyway by law. So when that happens, and we will make sure that everybody knows about it and what happened, so that they don't repeat. We don't have a repeat incident. The other thing that we will do is, and we've had a lot of talk about this. Remember, I guess it was maybe a year ago, the octuplets were born? Mm-hmm. Well, that was at a Kaiser Permanente hospital.
You must be so proud.
Well, unfortunately, we had, with electronic medical records, you just can't go into someone's electronic medical record. So there were some people who got curious, and they wanted to go and look at the record. Well, many of them were fired.
And these are doctors?
These are doctors. So we made it public. So to let people know that we're really serious about, we just cannot tolerate that kind of behavior. And, no matter how good you are, if you violate the policy, you have to go. This is zero tolerance kind of environment. So we have to do things like that as well.
I think there are some questions over here. Whoever's got the mic, ask your question and pass it, I guess.
Yeah. My question is, if you think about mobility, mobile devices, I think most of us think of them as enablers of innovation. Mm-hmm. Speed, collaboration, communication, time to market, personal productivity. They're all things we associate with innovation. Security is not necessarily viewed that way. And I'm just sort of curious for the panel, their view at a higher level, is there, do you get criticism, feedback that you're inhibiting innovation? How does security become an enabler versus an inhibitor? You sort of touched on it with usability versus security. I'm just kind of curious about the conversations that happen and how that's used in your organization.
So all my hardcore security friends will have heard this a number of times, but my favorite analogy, it's a fundamental mind shift. For sure, 20 and 10 years ago, we thought about security as the brakes, right? This is when security was largely about access controls on mainframes, and we hired a bunch of naysayers, and they were the police to make sure things that weren't supposed to happen didn't happen. And I think as a general culture, we're getting a little more acclimated to what I think is better thinking. On your car, what is the security system? Is probably going to be, if you draw an analogy, the brakes. Why do we? Why do we have brakes on a car? And then I think, yeah, so you can stop is the myopic answer, but the broader kind of, it's so you can go fast. Without brakes, we'd never be able to go past 15 miles an hour because we'd always have to coast to a stop, right? So security as an enabler, it's a fundamental, it's subtle, but it's kind of all the world of difference.
So that's a good concept, but how does that play out? Do it every day or every day?
So when we have these data breaches, I think when more of our friends and family have had lost devices to unsecured and unrestorable or lost data sets as a result of some corporation putting data on a handset or allowing, and then that was lost, or identity compromise, when more of this has happened that we feel the threat, I don't know that we really feel kind of an imminent danger from this stuff right now. I don't generally, even though, believe me, I'm paranoid when I use all my devices online. The level of paranoia would probably actually blow your mind in terms of what I do to make sure I'm always on the VPN going through corporate proxies and controls to make sure I have good protection. But when that is more of a real felt kind of thing, I think it'll wake people up to the fact that security is important, and it's, what's in it for me, making sure that your data is secure and your credit cards aren't used by the boogeyman on the internet to buy devices on eBay or whatever.
Anyone else want to take that one on?
Yeah, I would say that we have a security department. I don't manage the information security function, but many of the business people that I deal with would perceive security as stifling. They would just much rather, it's one thing to input your password on your iPhone to get into it, but then if we have a secure bubble within there where we're running, something else with another level of security before they get to the applications, they don't want to do that. I mean, it's like, why do they need to have multiple passwords on a single device? So, but the security people would say absolutely, because that phone has other personal things on it. So once you get to your corporate things, there needs to be another layer of security there, so they can get comfortable with it. So we do get viewed that way as we look to secure these devices.
There's another question or two over here.
I understand there's a concept of security for data at rest and security for data being moved. Concentrating on data being moved for a second, doesn't the recent press noticed events about Gulf countries trying to shut down the Blackberry networks, isn't that an endorsement for the security of the Blackberry networks in terms of data in transit?
Sure. I think the issues in this particular thing are pretty broad and sweeping in that, it's the governments of these entities want selective access, I guess, right? But for sure, the transport security. So I think the confidentiality of the data in transit is endorsed in that model, but at the same time, the federation of that data, one of the concerns I think BlackBerry messages globally route through Canada. So I think maybe that's another concern on it. More than we want to make sure we have access to it, I think their concern might have been if the United States has access to it, we want to have access to it as well.
I think that question comes back to a question I was going to pose anyway. Sort of being the moderator, I get to have a...
Do we get to ask you a question?
Absolutely not. Having not been the moderator recently, I enjoy getting to just ask questions and not answer. But sort of along the lines of that question, there has been a lot written in the past about the security or the insecurity of these portable devices and what a disaster it is and things like that, and how all of our cell phones are going to be turned off by a virus someday or what have you. And that just hasn't happened. We read about now attacks on bizarre controllers of Iranian nuclear plants, and we read about tapes lost from mainframes, and we read about attacks on databases of credit cards in a computer room somewhere. But this is, the horrible disaster of mobile security, but I can't think of a collection of horrible mobile security disasters, that I can actually cite. So is this actually a problem? Do we have good enough security in some areas like the Blackberries? Or when will it become a problem? Is there some reason that people haven't turned off all of our phones?
So I'll give you a couple thoughts on this. One is that for sure we are seeing a threat. Today's threat is a little more insidious than yesterday's threat. When it was the Morris worm stumbling into malbehavior, or Blaster, Sasser, Nimda type worms, that it was people trying to make fanfare. I think today people are trying to cause geopolitical harm, and people are trying to make financial gain. And this is more of a problem when we start doing more online banking on our mobile devices, or when we start controlling our SCADA networks from our mobile devices. The Stuxnet worm targeting system control advisory, the computers that control our power grids. So we're not using these devices for those things right now, I think is part of the reason we haven't seen the doomsday threat. Another reason, the uniformity of Windows-based operating systems created a lot of the threat on the PC. When we have multiple flavors of mobile device,
There isn't a monoculture yet, like there was with the Windows devices.
that's another big factor. But then a third factor in the other direction I'll submit for your consideration is there is actually, with the consumerization and the App Store on the iPhones and the iPads, there are a whole bunch of apps on these devices sending data in all kinds of ways that we actually aren't paying a tremendous amount of attention to. There's listening software people are starting to install on these to pay attention and say, hey, where is the data actually going? Because our walled garden approach to the iPhone, hey, I've installed it, it works, it's nice. No, don't talk to me about security. So we're starting to see the chinks in the armor of this kind of user experience. Security doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on that, particularly with, sorry if we don't go out of order, but like with the iPhone, look at the number of applications that there are. Now, are we confident that Apple has really vetted and security tested every one of those applications? And beyond that, I mean, let's assume that they have. Have they tested every update, every download, every secondary interaction that the application has had? I really think that the only reason we haven't seen a widespread outage yet is because there isn't yet one monoculture that dominates everything, and there's lots and lots of different applications. Look on the PC side. We see fewer and fewer attacks against the operating system. Microsoft's actually done a very good job of that. What are we seeing attacked today on the PC side? Adobe applications, which are ubiquitous. Java applications, which are ubiquitous. Other applications of that ilk that are kind of, we think of it as middleware. That's where the greatest vulnerabilities are, drive-by downloads to web browsers. So the attack vectors have changed. I think it's just a matter of time until there's a critical mass on for one of these devices or one of these operating systems that we'll start to see it. Are we seeing phishing attacks on these devices? Absolutely. Are people losing identities on these devices? Absolutely. Even though they're not going after the software necessarily. They're going after the people that are using the devices. And we have just as much of an issue with portable devices now as we have with desktops and laptops.
But Dennis, couldn't it be that we haven't had a major attack on the iPhone or major outage type of thing because like they're on AT&T and you wouldn't really know? You know, when they get on the real
No comment.
Another non-sponsor. I'm sorry for jumping in there. Oh wait, we have a question here. This lovely woman in the back has been very, very patient. Jump on in here. Come on in.
In the interest of, my name is Mary Corcoran, I'm from Boston College, and in the interest of full disclosure, I work with the moderator of the panel. So maybe I'll get him to answer a question.
You have our sympathies. I'm sorry.
I just have a couple of observations from the practitioner standpoint at university, which is that, number one, I think one of the challenges that we see is every 4 years you get a new group of students, and what corporate network would let 18-year-olds loose on their network unfettered? But that's what we have. They activate multiple devices. I was looking at the statistics the other day. There's several, more than several students that have 7 or 8 devices activated, so including their PlayStation and, you know, all that kind of stuff too. But one of the challenges there, I think, is that they don't have the same notion of privacy that the rest of us do over 30 years old, and I think that's an issue. We saw that with music when they came in and started sharing music, and you'd say to them, well, this is wrong, and they'd say, well, everybody does it. So I think that that's a number one thing for us is how do we deal with that and educate them, because to Dennis's point about education, it has to be meaningful to you. You have to understand why you care about it. And they don't really have identities yet that they are aware of that can be stolen. And then their notion of privacy, what they put up on social networking is just, you know, beyond the beyond. Secondly, just kind of in terms of, I'd like to challenge the panel a little bit in terms of education, and Dave will tell you I've spent my career in user education, and I believe strongly in it and think that we need to do it. On the other hand, when you have threats like this that are so pervasive outside, what can the infrastructure do to be better? Because I can always educate the user. I can always do that. The analogy that I like to think about is when viruses first came out, our network folks said, it's the user's fault, it's the user's fault. And we sort of said, well, you've got to be doing something, you know, to be looking for these. And we have. We've been very effective, I think, in taking a look at viruses. So it's the analogy more like Homeland Security, where you want people to be aware, you want them to understand what might be of import to them, but you don't expect them to secure the national infrastructure. So sort of where's the balance there? Because to quote a faculty member, we write lots of documentation, and they came back and said, I want to know what I want to know when I want to know it. And, you know, we laugh, but there's some truth to that. So, you know, to the point of that a number of you have made, when these things get publicized, that's when people start to pay attention. But how do we prevent that before, you know, they have that sort of meaningful or, as the case is, disastrous encounter?
I mean, my first issue with that, and I believe me, we're simpatico on this, but we don't know that the students are connecting to our network. You know, our network is really hostile. Okay, and part of it is by design. I mean, part of it is because every time we lock something down, somebody complains, and that becomes an impediment to somebody's research. But in reality, we don't know where the student's going to, or the faculty members are going to be getting an IP address. They can be, you know, what is the thing? The Jericho forum was talking about how there are no perimeters. Well, a faculty member who enjoys the safety of being connected to our network suddenly goes and does research in Belarus, and they connect and they're wide open and they get attacked. We make people assume that wherever you're connecting is hostile, because much of the time it will be. So that severely limits what you can possibly do on the infrastructure side. And on the other side, to the point we made before, there just isn't enough uniformity to put a client on everybody's machine that's going to somehow do the selective filtering. I mean, unless we can have every ISP in the world do that kind of filtering, I think this problem is going to be with us for a very long time.
We're doing some things. We are starting to put clients on each machine so that there's certain information we can find out what's going on that machine. I told you we're in the process of deploying some software to require encryption on drives that are plugged into USB ports. We're also starting to look at, should we deploy software so that we're sure of every device, and we can check every device that plugs into our network to make sure it's one of ours. You know, that's going to be, become intrusive, but we're looking at that. We also put up software in conjunction with Lotus Notes so that we actually scan any email that goes outside of the organization, and we're looking for social security numbers and those kinds of strings so that we can catch those emails before they go out, send a note back to the user, the person who's sending the email, and say, it looks like this message has personal identifiable information in it. Are you sure you want to send it? Or we can block it. We can take whatever action we think is appropriate. So we're starting to do some things like that to shore up the infrastructure such that we can crack some of these things or stop some things from happening in the environment, because you're right, and we have mandatory education. So each year you have to go through security education and you have to pass the test and those kind of computer-based training things. But even after that, people could still go do things that they shouldn't do.
Just a quick comment. One, you know, we're talking about the challenge of, oh, I can't make people carry 2 laptops. One thing that solves that problem in some people's mind is virtualization. You know, you don't need 2 screens and 2 keyboards to have 2 computers or logical kind of stores of data or perimeters of security. One thing people think is going to solve this problem, I disagree, but it's a religious debate, and you can probably be right on both sides of the fence at this point. Some people think, well, we can't, you know, enforce what we want on these mobile devices, so let's create a virtual instance or a virtual machine on that machine, and we will control what happens on that virtual machine. And so we don't extend corporate IT resources to the device broadly. We extend calendaring, messaging, data sources to that virtual instance, and that's it, which we can control and we can wipe. Probably this won't work in the long run, is my opinion, and that's because it's not simply mail and calendar that we need to do with our mobile devices. It's also browsing, and it's also these MyRate apps that are coming out for biomedical reasons, banking, financial, CRM software, all kinds of things. But that's one answer to the question, is some people think virtualization.
So all great comments. I wonder if we don't need to step back. So I listen to this, and I have a big headache. I have a headache of over-complexity. I have a headache of escalating costs and resources in this area. I have a headache that through all this great work, it's still highly ineffective. And yes, it's training, yes, it's technology, yes, it's this, yes, it's that. I have large file transfer, I have VPN, I have software that scans for identity, I encrypt everything known to man and God. And maybe it's working, maybe it's not. Time will tell. I also have the articles in the New York Times that point out the fact that why password change is highly ineffective, right? We've all seen them. So I wonder if as an industry we don't need to step back and reconceive the solution to the problem. And the analogy is when you go driving, I like the car analogy, when you go driving, the safety of your driving, for the most part, isn't dependent on the make, model, or road on which you drive. There are things that you can come depend on, like a stop sign is red, seatbelts, keeps you from falling out. And you think about driving and how basically safe it is, and how simple the approach to safety in driving is. What I hear us heading towards, and I guess I'd ask you to comment, is a highly complex world, and I'm not sure how secure it's going to be anyway. And so I wonder what we do with that observation.
I'll make a quick comment. As much as you feel secure driving, I would say that anyone who's been in a significant motor vehicle accident would argue we're 2 inches from death most of the time. It's kind of an organized chaos approach when we drive, just especially some of the roads around here, as my drive-in this morning would say.
It's an interesting analogy. How many people are killed in 40,000 or something? But in fact, it's a very low percentage. It's a small percentage. But we have accepted the fact that it's okay for 40,000 people to nearly die on the road. That's an acceptable level of risk. We don't have yet an analogous acceptable level of risk for this, and I think that speaks to your point.
Well,
Yeah.
leaving the analogy aside, if you don't agree with it, we have 5 minutes left, and I was going to pose a question just along the lines of this does seem to be complex, a relatively complex and non-solved problem. So as a panel, since this is an innovation type of a meeting, if there were some particular visioning or innovation, or some of the students earlier said putting stickies of wild ideas on the wall or something like that, what would you like to see if you could have an ideal world 5 years out with a mobile security?
I'd really like to see a framework for modeling this stuff. So if we want to evaluate, does it make sense, the decision criteria? Like, what is the value of the data we're going to put on? I don't think we're this mature, right, as an IT security community today. But in parts we are, and in ways we are, and I think this maybe in 5 years we can get to, right? So what's the risk I expose? Put some data behind it, quantify it with numbers and dollars. And then what's the exposure, and put some data to it with numbers and dollars, and use that as a financial planning model or an IT forecasting model to figure out what decision support, decision analysis.
Is the mobile world mature enough, and is the virtualized cloud world mature enough to do that model like that?
Well, ultimately, it's data, and we can value our data if we can even point to it and classify it and identify all of it. But therein lies the complexities.
The thing I like to see is a set of standards, consistent standards that can be applied at the different layers, so that we, at least as an industry, right, whether it's manufacturers or developers or whomever, we understand what those standards are, and we can know that, you know, those standards are met. So for people like myself, you know, I feel like I'm chasing this thing. You know, it's like a constant, you know, chasing. But if we had a set of standards that were applied at the different levels, and then either the manufacturers or builders of the hardware operating system applications knew what those standards were, we could consistently apply them and know that we're doing the best we can in this area.
Yeah, I agree for sure that you know, with standards, people and organizations don't like to meet them, but when you're forced to, you end up learning how to do things that you never expected you'd be able to do before from a security perspective. But I find myself wondering, you know, looking at this from the perspective of a journalist, of sometimes we have to learn by having bad things happen. And so I guess what I'm on the lookout for is, I don't believe in the idea that there'll be this digital Pearl Harbor where one day all of these mobile devices are brought down because of the lack of monoculture at this point, as you had mentioned, Dennis. But you know, I think for me what'll be interesting is what will happen when there is a widespread outage, and what will we learn from that? And this isn't something that's going to be helpful for you, but it's one of those things that I'm always on the watch for. You know, when this happens, you know, not simply because there's a headline, but sometimes there's that saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And nobody wants bad things to happen, but to me, the big thing will be, what do we learn when something does happen?
I gave a lecture at another college yesterday, a guest lecture for a friend, and I cited something that Thornton always talks about of how innovation happens. And I said there's four things: there's a shared space, a stretch goal, a time box, and diversity of opinion. And there's that old saying from, I think, Einstein, who said, we can't solve problems with the kind of thinking that created the problems to begin with. And the way we've solved security thus far on the internet is to say that every message, every packet, everything is innocent until proven guilty, and that model isn't working. You know, we can't possibly keep up with that, and so you look for other models and you look for other metaphors, and I find the open model intriguing. In the open community, like the open software community. There's no moderator. There's no judge that's adjudicating things. But somehow people's, or look at the online auction places where people's reputation is built kind of incrementally, and you get to a point where from groupthink you can tell something about an individual's reputation and whether or not they're trustworthy. And I keep thinking and hoping that somehow the internet is going to evolve to that point where you'll know something about the reputation of the individual at the other end, and we can begin to trust certain parties at the other end and have something where we say, now you're guilty until proven innocent, not the other way around. There has to be some kind of a breakthrough event like that, or it's still going to be too hard. And to the points that have been made thus far, I mean, if you look at the megatrends, the complexity is going up. Complexity is bad for security. The frugality, I was trying to come up with, driving here this morning, with things that are going up. Frugality is going up, right? We're doing things as cheaply as possible. There's no margin left in products for vendors to educate people. There's no margin or no resources left in most institutions. We're cutting help desks. We're cutting all sorts of other things. So we have to make it easier for people to do the right thing, and we have to make it easier to have trustworthy communication on the internet. And I'm hoping that it's something like the 1 minus n or the 1 minus n or n minus 1. I can't remember. The opposite model, the inverse model of what we have right now. I'm hoping that someday we can go to something like that.
Yes, I think this has been very interesting. We're out of time, right? Although it sounds like we could keep going much of the day if we wished. So thanks to all of you for the fascinating questions, and thanks to Dennis and Bill and Dick and Quentin for all of your contributions here.